So welcome to our Every Second Saturday series, Emerging Paradigms for Justice-Involved Ministry. We are excited to have you all with us. And can you see my screen okay, Mike?
Yeah.
Can we see it? All right, awesome. So today we are going to take what's really considered a horizon view. You know, you look out on the horizon of justice-involved ministry. What we mean by justice-involved ministry, I think it's really important to set definitions, because words build worlds, and words help us interpret our experiences and how we view our communities. So what we mean by justice-involved ministry itself is very broad. We consider justice-involved ministry anybody who has touched or is currently touching the criminal justice system, from arrest, individuals and families from arrest, all the way to post-release, to those that have experienced harm in the community by individuals who are currently in the system. We also believe that it is incredibly important, when we mean justice-involved ministry, that we are addressing both the harm that has occurred and those that have harmed. And so restoration and reconciliation are very much embedded in this. Also, I just wanted to define what a paradigm means, because again, we can all have different definitions of that. And so what we mean by paradigm today is it is a typical example or pattern of something, or a model. It's a pattern of behavior, it's a pattern of thinking, a pattern of how we do ministry. And as we know, 2020 pretty much blew up most of our patterns and models for ministry in this context. Can I get an amen on that, on that one? And I will like to offer this as just a basic reflection that sets the context for what Mike and I are going to be talking about, is that we are never going to go back to the way things were. You know, we just keep going forward. And we're not going to get back to normal. And we're not even going to get to a new normal, I don't think, because again, words build worlds, and normal to me means static, it means entrenchment, it means comfort, and the paradigms, as we kind of unpack what's emerging right now, is we're going to see that it is very dynamic. Our communities are very dynamic, and so we're going to be pushing toward creating models, patterns that are very fluid, that are very adaptive, that account for rapid and significant change going forward. So our opportunity really is now to form new models that do incorporate this. And so if you are recruiting, if you are leading, if you are training, if you're doing ministry in the same way, and you're trying to figure out how to do ministry in the same way, I just think you're going to get really, really frustrated, and you're going to have increased ineffectiveness. And so that's part of the reason why we're here today, is because we want every single one of you on this call today to be better at this ministry, to be more effective, because if we are more effective in restoring and repairing harm and working with those who have caused harm for accountability and things like that, then we're all better as a result of that. So so that's just kind of the context for what we're going to be going to today. So our first kind of salvo into the discussion is that Mike and I, we spend a lot of, you're going to kind of get inside our brains today, because we spend a lot of time looking out on the horizon, figuring out how do we lead people toward, you know, that next mountain and that vista view. And so we really believe that the emerging justice-involved ministry paradigm expands beyond a particular place or person for ministry, to really include a comprehensive approach. If we look at what is emerging, we need an approach to address all these things that have been revealed through the pandemic and the the decisions, the historical harms that have occurred through racial injustice and through social injustices. And so it's beyond, we are being called beyond a particular person or a particular place for ministry. And Mike, feel free to jump in wherever you want to go. So when we look at the paradigm, it is both, or the emerging paradigms, it calls us to be both intentional in how we work with individuals, but also our responsibility in the community. And so there are three characteristics that Mike and I think define kind of the paradigms that are emerging. One is complexity, one is connectional, and one is collaborative. So when we think about complexity, it's complexity of relationships, systems, and structures. It is much easier to go solo, right? It's much easier for us to say, all we need to do is. But when we look at what has occurred in the last year, what it really has is revealed this complexity of structure in our communities. It means that we can't just look at one person and say, you know, they just need a job when they come home, right? There are stronger forces at work in our communities. And if we think about ourselves, we are very complex individuals. Not every story is the same. Not everybody's experience is the same. So complexity is incredibly important as we go forward in navigating that. And Mike, did you have anything to add on that one?
Reba, you know, I was just waiting for you to ask.
I know you were, Mike.
You know, as it relates to this, ladies and gentlemen, Reba is 100% correct. And I know I've talked to several of you about this, and there's a whole science in and around complexity. And we have to view our communities as complex adaptive systems in that you have a whole system, a whole community that's made up of these interactive parts or pieces of the whole. And so the faith community sits as a piece of the whole, and we have to be better at managing that necessary interconnectedness and that adaptive and emergent, you know, those conditions that change over time. And one thing I think 2020 has done, it's put under the microscope of the reality of the complexities of our communities.
Yep. And then connectional. And we're going to unpack each one of these a little bit more. So we don't want to say too much, but you know, connectional relationships, what 2020 has really helped us to realize, hopefully, is that we are all leading from the middle, right? We're all working toward bringing people along into a certain way of being, but then we're also still trying to figure out for ourselves, we need leaders ahead of us that are helping us move in that way as well. So, you know, a lot of the time we think when we're under threat, we tend to retreat. But this paradigm, if we're going to keep moving forward together, we need to actually check that and actually go more connectional in nature. And then collaborative, it comes from, you know, the whole contextualization that is occurring. When we did our Building Bridges event back in November, we did these listening circles with different community contexts of metro, mid-size, and rural communities. And Mike and I were talking with another person yesterday about that. And it was really, really interesting how people viewed the pandemic based on their community context. One of the community contexts, there was a significant amount of fear around what was happening with the COVID pandemic. In another community context, it was more a loss of the connection in that community. And so what that tells us is that collaboration is going to be key because it is how we get towards solving the complex issues. It's how we get to being connectional and not feeling like we're isolated, and developing different solutions and strategies and resources. So I will say just this as we go forward, because we're going to start with complex and we're going to break that down a little bit, and then connectional, and then collaborative. But if our new paradigms require us to navigate complexity, to pursue connection and collaboration, then what does that really require of us as individuals who are involved in this work? And I just wanted to sit with you for a minute, because what it probably means, what we think it means, is that we have to be willing to share control and power, and we must sacrifice our comforts and our conveniences. Let me say that again. This is going to require us to share our control and our power, and to sacrifice our comforts and our conveniences. And what are the things right now that we really feel are under threat? Our ability to control and our power. A lot of that has been taken away, we think, from the pandemic. Convenience and comfort, those are things we're seeking right now. So just sit with that, because what we're going to be talking about is probably going to push some of us in a way that we really are uncomfortable with being pushed, because we're already under so much. And so this is a big, heavy lift. It's a big, heavy ask. But we hope that you'll stick with us, because on the other side of it, to get to a better place, we must pull people in and not push people out. We must pull ourselves together and not push each other apart. Okay? Because justice is going to cost us. All right. So are we ready to keep going? Okay. So connectional. So Mike, you're up.
Okay, Reba. I think as a part of the context for the discussion, we have to talk about where we've been and where we're headed. And there are a couple of pieces of literature. I think that everybody, every criminal justice professional, every private citizen who's bumping up against the justice system should read to really understand where we've been and where we're headed. And the first document is the 1974 study by Robert Martinson when he reviewed programmatic initiatives in the New York State prison system. And what Martinson found was that, just sort of boiling it down, that no program in and of itself led to rehabilitation. And during that time in our country, in the 70s, the war on crime, war on drugs, you had prison riots. And so what was termed as a result of that study was that nothing works. And so that really was a demarcation point. That is the spark that lit the fire toward mass incarceration in this country. The other piece of literature is the 1 in 100 study by the Pew Center. So in 2009, the Pew Center on the States reported that for the first time in the history of this country, 1 in 100 adults were either in jail or prison. We had truly entered into, for a period of time from the mid-70s to the early 2000s, a period of mass incarceration where we stopped looking at individuals who committed crimes and policies and practices over incarcerated the population. Okay, so that's the 1 in 100 study. And what it found further is that 1 in 31 adults were under some form of criminal justice oversight in our country. That included parole, probation, halfway houses, and so forth. And so since that time, it's important that we understand that the corrections systems in our country are moving toward mass reentry and away from mass incarceration. So the target is moving. And so this chart illustrates what we're talking about, that in a period from just take year end 2018 to the end of the year 2019, we saw a total of 33,600 fewer people in prison just in that short span of time. That was a 2% decrease. In 2019, the imprisonment rate fell for the 11th consecutive year, hitting its lowest point since 1995. And what we saw from 2009, when that Pew Center for the States report came out, to 2019 was a 17% reduction in the imprisonment rate for all US citizens. And it fell 29% among Black residents, 24% among Latinos, and 12% among white residents. In 2019, the imprisonment rate for Black residents was the lowest rate it had been in America since 1989. And so I'm not saying there's still not disproportionate incarceration. What I am saying, though, is that more people are coming back to communities from periods of incarceration than they ever have before. And so the era of mass incarceration is now turned into an era where we're facing challenges associated with how we integrate people, how we truly restore people back into community from a period of incarceration.
Mm-hmm. Great. So what does that then mean for community, right?
Exactly.
So we have to, because we are continuing to see this shift toward mass reentry, we have to then look at, can our communities hold these individuals safely in them? And so when we think about justice-involved ministry, it's not, again, a person or a place, it is an approach. And so our approach has to expand to our community context, and particularly around what are called the social determinants of health. And what's so interesting and in many ways sad about this is that the social determinants of health are both drivers into incarceration and also are barriers to successful reentry, right?
Mm-hmm.
So ministries, when we think of ministries that address the social determinants, you know, when we look at all of this, and we're going to talk a little bit more about and link this toward things like shame and isolation and stuff a little bit later, but a lot of our faith groups have ministries that are siloed, that are addressing these, but in a very, very narrow way. And I hope that part of our, by the end of our discussion today, what you'll see is that you have ministries that if they were to be able to come around these new paradigms and look at this, look from the view of social determinants of health, that you will see that you have far greater assets in just within your faith communities to really start addressing and moving toward justice ministry. But the social determinants of health ministries that address these also interrupt things like trauma, underground economies, and violence. And so why do, I think one of the central questions that we have to ask ourselves and reckon with is, why do some people feel that prison is actually a safer community environment than the one they came from and the one they're going back to?
Yeah.
Why do people that are in prison, some people, not all, but some, feel that that is a safer environment than the one they came from and the one they went back to, they're going back to? Why is it that they have to be imprisoned to actually get help for things like mental illness, addiction, domestic violence. Why is it that we are relying upon our prisons and our jails to do that?
Mhm. Reba, if I could chime in.
Well, of course you can, Mike Davis.
Thank you. You know, recently, Governor DeWine declared that racism is a public health issue, and we see here in these social determinants those elements that are force multipliers for entry into the justice system. And there's a gentleman by the name of Ernest Drucker who wrote a book called The Plague of Prisons. And one of the things he says, in sort of connecting the dots here between our health and wellness and community and over incarceration and the ability for people to desist from crime, is recognizing the similarities between health epidemics and the epidemic that was mass incarceration. And he says that health epidemics are characterized by their immensity and the subsequent mortality rate or disability produced by the crisis. Comparisons can be drawn certainly between mass incarceration and health epidemics along the lines of disproportionate impact that both have on the socially and economically disadvantaged. And included in the comparisons between those epidemiological factors and elements of mass incarceration is certainly the stabilizing effects on communities that experience high rates of imprisonment among residents. Mass incarceration, the effects of it on local communities are substantial as it relates to the large-scale ramifications of the quality of life for individuals in these disadvantaged communities. And the implications for these communities are found in the destabilization of local social interactions in neighborhoods, and are exacerbated by the return of the justice-involved population that I'm not sure local communities are adequately resourced for. Clearly, families are disrupted, social networks are interrupted, as I mentioned, employment opportunities are dissolved, and personal well-being is jeopardized by mass incarceration and the subsequent re-entry of the justice involved. And so these social determinants, as well as those community structural factors, have a cascading effect on the population, on the social interactions across disciplines that include the collective neighborhood. And so we see that across the board in review of the literature, that housing and employment, the neighborhood context, all have a cascading and total effect for those who are returning to the community from prison.
Yeah, and Mike, I want to pull up that that graph. This is a really interesting. Oh. Yeah, if I can get to it. There we go. Do you see the coronavirus thing or no? All right, let me see what I can do. Give me just a quick second. Okay, so this is, Mike, talk about this a little bit, because just what you were saying and how you can find out perhaps where the most vulnerable communities sit.
Yeah. So this map the Department of Health has put together to help us identify where communities have sort of opportunity, and where there's essentially a lack of opportunity and lack of access to those things that really have an impact on wellness. And so the thing, as you've been working with the justice-involved population over time, you realize is that reentry is not equal opportunity, in that it doesn't occur at the same rate everywhere. And so the thing that I think the coronavirus and our attempts to respond to it have illustrated is that there are communities, neighborhoods, certain and specific census tracts where there's disproportionate inequity relative to services, relative to resources, and relative to the ability of those residents to do well. And crime is a part of that, but also the conditions that lead to relative destabilized neighborhood effects, and that includes your healthcare, diabetes, obesity, infant mortality. All of these things certainly exist, and so this website shows you exactly where those concentrated and distinctive communities are. And Reba, just let me say one more thing. And our folks in Cleveland may remember several years ago now, the Urban Institute did a study on prisoner reentry in Ohio and found that of all the people coming to prison from the city of Cleveland, the majority of them were coming from only 5 neighborhoods. 5 neighborhoods. And that's true everywhere. And so you look at, I'm not sure what.
This is Cuyahoga County in Cleveland, but what do you want to look at?
Well, no, we're fine because it is true everywhere. So I don't care if you look at Gallia County. I don't care if you look at Allen County. The concentration of poverty, right, is in certain locations. And where that is, I will guarantee you, based on the literature, based on the evidence and research, that you will find people in those communities who are disproportionately justice involved. And so I think it's important that we recognize that the majority of criminal justice research and focus, and it is right to do so from the prison context, is focused on those individual level factors that pose risk for reincarceration. But I think it is our responsibility to look at this issue as 2 co-evolving, complex systems at work, the individual and the collective. And if we do so, we serve everyone well. And so I think you find in communities this level of self-organization. You see communities that experience episodic events of crime or violence, and we've seen that this year. And without direction or formal leadership, we see people band together to start block watches, community rallies, and it leads to responses and strategies to address those issues. And those are the things that are complex, more difficult to manage, but these are the things that determine whether or not a person is going to be successful returning to Mount Pleasant, returning to Glenville, or returning to Linden or Bond Hill or West Dayton. And those are the things that I think we have to address on this side of the equation.
Right. And what and the other thing is that we often think about those communities and we paint them with a color, just to be honest. And what this research is showing us is that that's not true, that that's not necessarily true, and not discounting that this proportionate burdens have been placed in communities of color, but it's also in communities of a certain socioeconomic
Reba, let me just say
standing.
Let me just say this, that you're 100% correct. So I don't care if you go to Hillsborough, I don't care if you go to Gallipolis, Ohio. The same thing is true, that the justice involved individuals come from communities that are disproportionately socially and economically disadvantaged. And there's a connection to their health, and their wellness. And you see that no matter where you go.
That's right. Yep. So, and this is, just to keep moving, but here's just another illustration of why it is important that when we think about justice-involved ministry, that we look at it from, again, a comprehensive approach. And Mike and I were looking at this the other day, and isn't it interesting that the adverse childhood experience is clear down here at the very beginning of a person's formation in community, right? In a family community is the same as the adult incarceration population.
And Reba, just as a lay person looking at that grabbed us. And so I don't know about formal connections. However, I can say if you poll, I know for a fact the women at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, and you ask them about the number of adverse childhood experiences prior to their incarceration, you would know that there are tie-ins. And so when we mentioned before those social determinants, or when we look at community characteristics, again, we see that cascading effect. ACEs, as they're called, adverse childhood experiences, childhood poverty, high school graduation rates. And so these numbers you see are Ohio's rank out of 50, right? Number one means you're doing wonderfully well. You're the best, or you, in this case, you would have the lowest number of ACEs in your population. We're 38. We're close to the bottom in all of these aspects. And so you see the cascading effect of poverty. And if you see poverty, I'm going to almost guarantee you, and I think the literature here says, and this is from the Health Policy Institute of Ohio, and we were introduced to this by Ohio Minority Health Director Angela Dawson. But when you see poverty, we can almost guarantee you're going to see increased risk for health-related conditions, which include high blood pressure, diabetes, post-traumatic stress disorders. And so many of the individuals who are incarcerated and now are returning to community have an overabundance of these conditions. And so the question is, are we prepared and resourced to address these issues? As you see, the 38 ranking for incarceration, and then we have a 43 out of 50 relative to unemployment. And we wonder why things are difficult when you look at
Right.
the totality of these metrics.
Yeah. So I think, when we think about emerging paradigm, then doing justice is really all encompassing of prevention, prison, and post release. And for those of us who are, Christians, there were several methods, I guess, or principles and approaches that God gave us in Scripture. One of my favorite is Isaiah 58, 6, and actually I think it goes through 15, when he talks about when, the prophet Isaiah says, if we're going to, you can do your laws, you can, worship me, you can do it, but if you're not doing these other things, if you're not looking at in your community, if you as a collective nation are not working toward these kind of things, then, I'm not moving in that. So I think that, when we, again, again, if you are a Christian or a person of faith and you believe that humanity, right, that humanity is worth is worth it, then we have to look at the totality of what is happening. So we're going to do a quick break. We're coming up upon an hour. One of the things I always talk about with my groups is, there's a difference between what is available in the community and then what is accessible to the community. We make a lot of things available, particularly faith groups. We love to talk about, we fed 500 people. We have a clothing closet. We have all these things are available. We make things available. But do we make them accessible? Do we require somebody to find transportation to come get what we have? You see what I'm saying? So I want us to, I'm going to launch us into some breakout groups, and there are 4 questions that I would like for you to discuss. We'll have about 10 minutes. And if you need to take a little bit of a break, if you get done in 8 and you need to step off, get another cup of coffee or whatever, feel free to do that. But we want to really help you kind of think about, because what we just presented was huge. It's like, oh my gosh, my community, there's so much. But you have things that you have that are available. What we want you to hopefully see is, wow, there are some things I can do that are emerging that can make it actually more accessible and actually work towards then delivering on the justice, the restoration that we hope to see. So I'm going to put us into breakout rooms. Never done this before, but we are going to do it. We're going to do that. And so you'll have something pop up and it'll say that you want to be, room 3 or 4 or whatever that is. And you just click on that and it'll take you in there. And then I will let you know in your breakout rooms what time you'll get a minute's notice to come back. I will also post these questions in the chat feature so you will have them available to you. So we are going to start with that. So I see you guys are joining.
To me, symbolizes the necessity and need for us to expand beyond, to address people where they are in their poverty, intervene in those adverse experiences, and not wait to serve them after they've caused trauma themselves, after they've maimed, hurt, murdered in our communities.
And that's why when we were looking at this, or we were developing this, we put, and this is just what Mike was talking about. The first one was about the individual, and this is more the communal, but prison, post-release, and prevention. And prevention is out here, right? You would think it would be before prison, but it's really out here as we push toward this more balanced approach. So, and I will say this just to add to Mike, is oftentimes I bump up against people that are here, right? And they're advocating for, particularly during the pandemic, there was all over the news about advocating to get people released, people who are low-level offenses for drugs, or who are so ill that they will never commit another crime again. And definitely when we look from a humane perspective, and you would certainly need to address the incarceration of addiction at some point. But let's say that those people were released, right? And we got justice for them, right? If our communities are not prepared, right? If our communities are not prepared, then what happens? Are we not putting them in greater danger? Are we not putting other people in greater harm because there's no access to recovery services? So we have to be, again, it's got to be a balanced approach. And as Mike has said several times, the capacity of the community, we have to work, if we want to really work towards justice-focused ministry, it has to encompass the capacity of the community. So here's our we're just rolling right along into these breakout groups. So I want you to break out into your group and list the justice involved ministries that are available through you or your church group right now. Justice involved. Where are you right now in this graphic? And then list, reflect on what type of ministry each of them is, and you'll do that as you list them, and then report out where the majority of your ministry efforts are within the spectrum, and then reflect on what you can adjust and change to move toward a more justice-focused ministry. Just small steps. What we found out is as we voice things, we become more accountable to them. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing the breakout rooms. So I'm going to break us out, and it says 10 minutes. Some of you were coming back a little bit early, so let's say then it's 11:17 right now. So we'll come back at 11:25. If I can get this done right. All right, you should be receiving things to join.
And it keeps going unmuted. I keep muting it. Sorry.
Nope, that's okay. So, So when we think about collaboration, we need to think of it as restorative, not only for the individual coming back, but for the community as a whole. So whenever we think of collaborating, we need to look at where we sit as a church or as a faith group or as a nonprofit. We need the collaboration of our correctional agencies or policing agencies as well, because the justice system is long and big, but it's not necessarily always linear, and that's something we need to keep in mind. And then the compassionate community of the private sector, the business owners, the banks, those kind of things. So if we're going to look at the new paradigm, we need to look at from the lens of restorative collaboration, that cross community work framework for justice involved ministry. Why are we doing this? Why is it important? And we can go right back to those social determinants of health, go back to the chart that Mike Davis talked about on where we sit as a state as far as rankings, those kind of things. But we believe that the faith community is uniquely positioned to draw these entities together, and maybe they draw it together and then go to a formal coalition. But the reason why the faith community is able to draw all this together is because we have people in our congregations and in our communities that are in each one of these sectors. We have business owners. We have people that work in banking. We have people that work in correctional agencies, that are on the police force, that are elected officials. We have people that work in nonprofits and different kinds of ministries. So we have this unique position to be able to draw together around particular restoration work. Okay. Mike, anything to add?
Oh, Reba, you know it. Let me just say this, and I don't know if they're on the line, but there were some partners. I guess I dare say friends. At least I considered us to be friends and partners in ministry that met with me at my office outside the office. And one of the things they had done, Healing Broken Circles at Marion had created community inside the facility. And we spent many afternoon, sometimes into early evening, talking about the necessity of creating community outside the gate. And the reason, and my heart just aches, in Columbus, where I am right now, we're in the 9th day of the month, I believe, and we've had a murder for every day this year. We're coming off of a record number of homicides in the community. And so the reality is this intersection of the criminal justice system, the community, and your role is necessary if we truly aim to serve those individuals who are incarcerated and make our communities places of safety and well-being for all of us. I think, and I'm drawn to Matthew, I believe 20, with all these pastors on the line, just put in the chat box if I'm wrong about this, but Matthew 23:23, Jesus in the text chastises the religious leaders of his day for essentially majoring in the minors and minoring in the majors. We're called to do justice. And I think we have disproportionately focused on these other aspects of the work. And there are others aside from Healing Broken Circles that do that difficult, that complex work in environments that are not necessarily as safe as our institutions. But in order to ensure the well-being and thriving of the people who are returning, the people who are currently in those communities, and us who live in communities that bump up against it, we have to do this well.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was on mute myself. All right, just trying to navigate here for us. All right, so moving on. So how do we do it? How do we do it well? Where do we start with this restorative collaboration in a justice-focused ministry? It's authenticating the issues affecting the community. So so if we are indeed uniquely positioned, then how do we bring people together? So authenticating the issues affecting the community is really a critical piece in that. It's getting, inviting a conversation with your police captain, along with the principal of your school, along with, somebody who is doing prison ministry, and maybe your reentry coalition person, and then inviting others to just sit, listen, learn, connect the dots for people, and how this continuum of care, what it looks like. Listen to the community members. One of my biggest pet peeves in ministry is whenever we serve people food. We have this great food pantry, or we have this great evening meal, yet we don't know what brought people to us, particularly in our churches, right? We have this great clothing closet, and once a week we serve our quote unquote serve our community in a particular way, but we don't know why we have to continue to serve the same individuals in that way. So authenticating the issues is even inviting conversation with the people that we are currently serving, to hear their story, understand what they're facing, and then go from there. Let them lead the way. One of the people on our call today is Nancy Reilly from Amlin United Methodist Church, and we just gave them a grant yesterday because they have been welcoming congregation to an individual who came home from incarceration. He was out in the community. He had a conversation with the police chief, I believe it was, that led to another conversation with this amazing ministry that's pretty close by. And now it has opened the eyes of the congregation with this one individual who has authenticated for them the issues that are happening in their community, and now they are growing in that ministry, and it's a wonderful story. So those are the things we need to do. Again, justice costs us. It costs us the comforts of thinking we know what is best, of thinking we know what people out in our community need, that are vulnerable when perhaps we don't. So it's a mutualization of the accountability for not only repairing the harm, but in just being in relationship with people in a way where we learn from each other. So then that leads to co-learning and co-laboring together. That is restorative collaboration practice, because it maximizes and mutualizes, right, the development of more equitable strategies and solutions. One of the leading justice-involved ministry or justice-involved organizations in the country, Just Leader USA, I believe that's what it's called, Mike, right? The one Deanna Hoskins runs. But is that right, Mike? I don't want to.
Yeah,
you're
correct.
Just okay. And so one of their mottos is the people closest to the issue, people closest to the problem are the people closest to the solutions. And so that's what we mean by co-learning and co-laboring. And then implement ministry based on co-mission and co-location. I know when Mike and I first started working together, and of course, West Ohio, like I said before, 66 counties, and so many prisons set within our counties, but it is unrealistic for us to ask a pastor way down on the river in Brown County to minister to somebody clear up in Lima. Just unrealistic. But as we've shown today, there are things that pastor can be doing in his community to prepare for his congregant member who is in Lima, who is going to be returning home, to prepare the community to be a place of safety and a place of wellness for that individual when they return home. So co-mission and co-location are really, really important in this work.
Hey, Reba, I'm sorry.
Yep.
I just have to jump in here. I didn't do my homework last night, so I don't know which, I can't remember which slide is next. But I have to say this, because this is crucial and this is vital. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say it. So there is no more time for us justifying ourselves in this work. And so one of the things I think we've seen on this end, on my side of the fence, is we get a lot of people who come into our environment in order to justify themselves, in order to preach the natives, in order to shine light into the lives of those who are in darkness. And that is not to be trivialized in any way, but the reality is, unless you are also addressing what Reba's just gone over and doing it from community context, we are only engaging in elements of discussion similar to the lawyer and his discussion with Christ, and we're seeking to justify ourselves, because those individuals who are in our prisons, 95% of them, I think the data shows, are returning back to community after only 36 months on average.
Yep. And there's only so much you can do in 36 months, right? With anybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the development or the redevelopment or
Yeah.
the restoration or the healing with anybody.
Reba, we've had far too many encounters with co-laborers who come in, and then when people try to connect outside the gate, they say, not us, not here.
Okay. All right. So we're going to move on because we're running out of time. Breakout discussion group we're not going to do because we want to get through a couple things, but here are some reflections and some steps for you to go back into your areas of ministry and start working through. They're just great to guide you as you step more into what is emerging over the next years. Who knows how? I mean, it's always, something's always emerging, right? That's what the complexity is all about, is again, everything is always changing, and we've got to become more adaptive and embrace what is emerging so that we can continue to be co-laborers around this work. So justice focused prevention ministry, I'm just going to run through this really, really fast just to kind of give you some handles. So when you start to go back and have conversations with people, when you start to ruminate, I'm a processor, so I take stuff and I'll sit and listen to these kind of things, and then then I have to start connecting the dots on my own. But I want to connect a few for you here as you kind of do this. So what has emerged and what the pandemic has really shown a light on for a lot of people is that justice prevention ministry often focuses on just the family, and the child, right? Making sure that they are well cared for, and that the kid feels connected to whoever's incarcerated and that kind of thing. But what we've come to understand is that that family and that child is the first community, but it is significantly, everything is connected to the neighborhood and the larger community. And we also know that this means that it is also the beginning of the school to prison pipeline. So prevention, if we can cut this piece off, this small circle off, and actually do some restorative work with that, do some repair within family and community, that the whole rest of this thing, right, it ripples into the whole rest of this thing. So if we are really talking about de-incarceration of our country, it all starts with that small circle. Okay. And so then justice focused ministry with the emerging paradigms, this is, Mike's going to talk a little bit about this, because we often find there are myths that keep us from actually stepping forward. And so he's going to, Mike, you just cue me when you're ready to move from one to the other, but if you would just take this one.
Sure. Thanks, Reba. Yeah, I think this is big and something that really has been evident and part of some of our discussions, but made evident in the pandemic when people couldn't get in, is the thought that people are not getting served relative to spiritual formation, spiritual growth, and religious needs. And I just want to assure everyone that we have a very well qualified and well equipped team of chaplains that serve the individuals in prison. In addition to that, case managers, unit managers, and staff who are positioned to address the habilitation, treatment, and service needs of the population. So I don't want you just thinking that people are going without. There are staff, though it might be different, though it might not be as fluid as before, resident needs are being addressed. And I'll just say, just real quickly, Reba, that the staff and the men and women who are currently incarcerated are also a part of the vaccine plan of the governor. So people did receive the vaccine in accordance with phase 1A, which included those in the equivalent for us of those in long-term care in hospital type situations. They're now moving on to phase 1B, and that will include those correctional facilities that fit those characteristics as well. So I wanted to assure you that the needs of the men and women in prison are being met at a high level and to the extent possible in this current situation. And pre-pandemic, that was happening at a even higher degree and level. All right.
Do you want to talk about can't serve justice involved people outside of prison?
Yes, thank you, Reba. I think we make a good team. Thank you. So one of the things for those of you who have been volunteers with the department, you understand that we have oftentimes multiple priorities. Sometimes those priorities bump up against each other. And one of those is the fact that we have as priority safety and security for the resident population, the staff, and you as our volunteer partners and co-laborers. In addition, we love the interaction and engagement from our volunteers and community partners. And so one of the things we always have to watch for are sort of those elements when there are unauthorized and interactions between the incarcerated population and attempts to take advantage of and that goes both ways. So there are, as a general rule, a requirement that there is no unauthorized contact or engagement with the incarcerated population or those under our jurisdiction. That does not mean that you cannot engage in our system or come into our facilities and then not work with individuals who've been justice involved. The key, let me just say, the key is communicating clearly your goals, objectives, and purposes for the communication. Anything that is unknown to us is unauthorized. Now, if a person is no longer under our authority, they're free and clear. They're as free and clear as I am, and probably by and large, I probably need more supervision than they.
All right.
Okay.
You want to say anything about truths? I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory.
I think so. I think this is the thing, is that your reality or your perspective is not necessarily truth. that the level of knowing of our staff, for example, the case managers, the unit staff, the chaplains, the wardens, there is a lot of knowing that you can glean from to better serve. I think there is a perspective that says, I'm from the outside, I know better than you what needs to happen in Mansfield is a dangerous place to be. And it's why we need to have communication. It's why we need to have clarity, transparency, and that collaborative approach so that you can learn from us things about the cultural context of incarceration that sometimes are imputed back into community, okay? And so your perspective is not necessarily truth. I think it's important that we understand that.
Yep. And then here's some of the reality of what residents really need. And this is particularly for folks who have traditionally been in traditional prison ministry and aren't able to go in right now and those kind of things. But you can still serve the residents by serving their families out in the community, by sending some encouragement, by helping family members process, the grief and those kind of things. In fact, in the chat, Kim Elliott just mentioned, families and how we need to be serving our families better. And so that's incredibly, incredibly important that, and that gives them hope. That gives the individuals inside hope to know that their families are safe and cared for. And that they will be, embraced when they come back into the community. All right, we're going to move on.
I'm sorry, Reba, just real quick.
Yep.
I just want to say it's a problem when we have women at the Ohio Reformatory for Women who say, I feel more love here now than I ever did in community. And like we mentioned before, the crime that's occurring, the opioid epidemic that's occurring, we're kidding ourselves if we only work and serve those individuals and don't understand the context that they're going back into and the one they came from to our facilities.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So then when we talk about post-release justice-focused ministry, this again pulls out some of those aspects of the school to prison pipeline. But just if you start in the far left corner, upper corner, upon release, felon status makes all old outlawed forms of discrimination legal. But if you follow that on down and around, you will see, again, this goes back to making that link between the social determinants of health, the family, prevention, all of those kind of things that we've just been talking about. I like this graphic because it kind of wraps it all into a neat package, so to speak, and makes it, brings the dynamics down to just a base level. So whenever we think about reentry ministry, we need to not only be thinking about who is coming back, but thinking about, where they will be moving and what they'll be facing when they come back into the community. And so finally, this is kind of our last thing, justice-focused ministry. This wonderful book that I've been having quotes from throughout our time together by Danielle Sarid of Until We Reckon. Okay, she talks about these 4 drivers for violence, and shame, isolation, exposure to violence, inability to meet one's economic needs. Research has shown those are the 4 drivers for violence. When we think about the faith community, just, what we offer as people of faith, the first 2 are right in our wheelhouse. They are right in our wheelhouse. So if you do nothing else but focus on understanding better how shame and isolation drive harm in your communities, you are doing a just service with justice-involved individuals and your community. But there's these direct links, and we just wanted you to understand that, these social determinants of health and how they, as Mike said, are a force multiplier into the criminal justice system. but this is the cycle. This is the cycle right here, because we also know the justice system was not designed to address shame and isolation and exposure to violence, trauma, aka trauma, high-level trauma, and inability to meet one's need. Now, Ohio does a pretty good job. It can do better, as we all know. Everybody can do better, but it is not upon the justice system itself to address these drivers. It's upon us in the community. So in order for prison and reentry ministry to contribute to that systemic and the structural changes toward justice, it's got to be restorative. We've got to have a restorative mindset. We've got to have and we've got to operate from these restorative and racial justice paradigms. We are reaping what has been sown over generations upon generations of suppression, of discounting people, of redlining, you know, those kind of things are forward, right? They have moved forward, and so we cannot separate that kind of historical injustice, historical harm from this work. And one of the good things is that we are going to, we're like, the series is called Every Second Saturday. So every second Saturday for the rest of 2021, we are going to be digging into these kind of things to continue to equip and resource you, and to build community around how do we live into these emerging paradigms. But here are 4 steps that you can take. And again, because of time, we want to leave a few, well, it is noon, so we're in effect out of time, but here's some steps that you can take to start really processing what you've learned today, what we've talked about today in our groups, those kind of things. Here's where we're going to be headed over the rest of this year is Mike and I have talked long and hard about this whole thing of cultural competency and being able to discern the cultural patterns that are going on, and incorporate different worldviews. We all experience community differently. And cultural competency is a way, it's a social science, it's developmental. We all can develop greater competency in being able to seek commonality toward things, but also hold our differences in the same space and work toward better solutions that are more equitable and more just for everyone. And underneath that cultural competency in this space of justice involved ministry, we believe that implicit or unconscious bias awareness is critical. It starts with us. What do we bring to the table that can be barriers? And then the restorative justice framework, a racial justice framework, and trauma-informed care. And so, you know, every second Saturday is going to be incorporating these things as we go forward. But in the meantime, here are some great resources between now and next month for you to check out and maybe start doing some of your own developmental work on that. They're all, I think, open and free and all that. And then upcoming opportunities, every second Saturday series, February, March, April, we're going to really be working on ourselves and cultivating our call. Where are you being called? What are some of the barriers just internally? We have to look internally and externally. So just really equipping ourselves in a deep, deep way to be able to be responsive instead of reactive to what is happening and the paradigms that as they continue to shift and change and grow. And then May and June is creating that community, and then how do we bring that out into our communities of faith and into our general community. So those are some things to put on your calendar. And then as Mike mentioned, we are one of the other groups that I help lead is our Building Bridges group. And so we have not negotiating, we're partnering with the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction around bringing some issues, some help to families in particular around things like healthcare, basic reintegration, how is my loved one being prepared to return home? What do I need to expect when my person comes home from incarceration? So those are going to be every other month on the second Tuesday of the month. And so this month coming up, it's not a sexy topic, but Medicaid and reentry. But right now, healthcare is foremost in our minds. And so they're going to be talking about what is available as far as healthcare for individuals who have been incarcerated or are returning from incarceration. Final thing is, there is a reckoning that we have to do around how we look at our justice system, how we use our justice system as part of our dynamic community context. Within that community context, I like to say to some of our churches sometimes, we've been praying years, faith leaders have been praying for years for revival. There is no revival without a reckoning. Because we all have a responsibility and a role in what got us to where we are today. And so reckoning, reconciliation, restoration, and redemption are all part of this new paradigm that we're living into. And so that's all. Meg, did you have anything to add to that before we release people? I do have one more poll. But before we release people, we do want to spend time with you if you would like to do some question and answer and want to hold on to that. But I'm going to launch this poll as we go into our Q&A time. And if you need to leave, we are just really, really thrilled that you spent a couple hours with us today. Hopefully it was helpful. You can tell us that on the poll. But we would love to have you continue on this journey of learning and growing together and working towards more justice-focused ministry. So Mike, anything to add?
Only that I certainly appreciate you, love you for the work that you're doing, that you're endeavoring to do, and that you will do. And just know we're here to help you. My concern is, and has been during the pandemic, that people were stopped and they were gazing up. And so why gaze ye up when we've been told to, in this case, to do justice, love mercy, and walk in relationship from a faith perspective with the Lord. And that's what we're endeavoring to do here, is to make sure we're moving toward that idea of doing justice so that people are fully incorporated back into community without the impediments that prohibit them from full citizenship and the benefits that are bestowed upon us as Americans. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
All right. Any questions for us? You can unmute and ask if you need to.
I would like to propose to my organization that we start a reentry group. My question would be, though, upon proposing this to them, of course, the biggest question is funding. How would we have the funding for this?
Mike?
I think probably the best thing to do, and I see that Brian Byorth is on with us, is to connect to the local reentry coalition in your area. They have relationships and work with the Department of Correction and the Office of Reentry within ODRC. I think there has to be, when you're talking about funding, as you know, very specific items that you're seeking to address. And so I think it takes some planning and organizing, which I know the Office of Reentry is willing to do, and so are those local reentry coalitions.
Other questions?
Thank you.
Other questions?
Reba, this is Jerry.
Yes.
My question is more about, you talked about us being lower down on the list among the states. Are there other examples of other states that are doing this well that we could learn from, and maybe have one of our presentations over the Saturdays be about just some examples of things that are working well that maybe we could emulate?
By this, you mean define this?
Well, you talked about you talked about, at one of your slides early on was about that we ranked 38 in different areas.
Yes.
And so if we look at the states that are like in the ones and twos, even up to the last 5, what are they doing differently than what we're doing? And can we learn from them?
Hey, Jerry, this is Mike. I think a couple of things. One is that when it comes to reentry, Ohio is one of the best states relative to its response and the development of an internal system within the department to reentry needs. And then that's sort of been played out in the development of these coalitions over time. I think the important thing is to recognize that there is a push and a need for us to do so much better broadly across the board. I think we've dealt with this in a narrow space, but identifying those factors like ACEs, the connection to poverty, the connection to unemployment is something I don't think we've done well. And states who necessarily are ranked higher aren't necessarily doing reentry well. There are conditions in communities and in states that position them better along those social determinants of health and wellness.
Gotcha. Okay.
I would say too that some states do certain aspects of it well, but not necessarily the totality of it well. And maybe that's kind of what Mike was saying. But at the end of the day, I think, you know, what we showed you as far as the numbers and the stats, that just captures what is happening in the local community. So maybe it is finding those local communities that are addressing these things well, that have models that are working well, because you know, the state can only drive so much. And I think it's important that, you know, our governor is focused on looking at the social determinants of health and everything, but unless the community is engaged in wanting that same thing, and again, it goes back to that control and power dynamic. You know, if we look across the state, are we willing to share our control and our power from big centers to smaller centers, or from, you know, poor community, more at socioeconomically stable communities to less, to those that have more rates of poverty in them. So, you know, it's a heart thing as well for us as citizens to say, I'm doing okay here, but I know so-and-so isn't over there. Now, what can we do to help galvanize our community to see that connection and invest, so that we're all doing better?
Yeah. And that's part of the reason I'm asking is what can we learn really from other states, anybody, whether it's churches or state governments or any other program, is what can we learn from others that are doing it well? And it comes down to sharing information too, right?
Right.
Which is what you're aiming for here. And what can we, is there something we haven't thought of that somebody else is doing that we could add to our program?
Right. Right.
Hey, Jerry, can I step in and say this? Because I don't think Reba will say it, but as a practitioner, as a criminal justice practitioner, but also as a social scientist, I don't think anybody's doing this. You know what I mean? I hope that's I don't mean for that to be a discouragement. I hope it's an encouragement in that we're on the forefront and the cutting edge in development. So I think the big thing is, it's not that we don't know. So in communities, there are a lot of resources in communities. The issue is, why aren't there the connections to the resources, or why isn't there access in the rural communities, in discussions and in looking at the literature? A lot of times it's just like issues like transportation. And so those things, for example, extend beyond the work of a Daryl Graves or a Brian Byorth or a Ronette Burks or a Mike Davis. Those things have to be played out in community spaces. And so I think, unfortunately, we're drawn to prison, and it's and we need, you know, those connections, but it's almost like a gravitational pull where we're looking in and missing what's all around us. And so I think our goal here, and one of the things Reba and I challenge each other on, is how do we move the state? How do we get everybody ignited to addressing what's around them? People will call me and ask, are you feeding the men and women inside a prison? When around us, ACEs, poverty, trauma, homicide, suicide, opioid overdose, we're missing everything because we're pulled into this, into the orbit of our prison system. And so we're trying to push, saying, hey, in order for everybody to be successful, we have to address all those elements that are around us, that actually are beyond our extension. So, Jerry, what you guys are doing is a model for what everybody has to do. And so when people call from the state of Illinois, we've been on conference calls with them. We've had visitors from Tennessee. Reba and I were at a conference, and Singapore was wanting to copy elements of this. We're doing it and developing it now. And I think it's like, okay, let's look around us. The Lord says the harvest is ripe. But he was looking around and had compassion on everybody that was around. And so if we fix the majority, which are in community, the minority, which are in prison coming out, will do so much better if our communities are well.
I think too, and then if there are any other questions, we can only hold so much knowledge. At some point we have to do. So, you know, what is it that we're willing to do? And who are we willing to lead in being able to do that? So again, it's a both and. I love to look at models and get information and stuff, but what am I going to do with it, right? So I have to sometimes just say, I can only go, you know, learn so much before I have to figure out what to do with it to start with. So any other questions?
Hi, Reba. This is Pavan. How are you doing? And
I am well, sister.
by the way, so I really enjoyed everything that you guys presented today. Just had a comment. So Vaughn was in here looking. He's left by now, but as you know, we're working with an individual who is a re-entry person, right? So in about a year, and this person's made great strides in coming out. I think it always starts in the person's mind, right? So this person's realized that they don't want to go back to the situation that put them in the incarceration position in the first place. And he was tested by that because he did have a chance to go back to family in the same environment for a visit. But once he got there, he's like, nope, you know, everything that got me in the situation that I was in before is still here. So I am not going to stay here and risk, you know, going back. So it takes maturity and a realization of that person in themselves that they don't want to repeat or put themselves in the situation that got them into the prison situation in the first place. So with that, you know, they've gotten employment, and now they're working on getting their own a place, you know, to stay. But they are running into roadblocks, and I think some of that comes to the things that you presented with how the community may be slow in accepting people coming out of those kinds of situations. And there has been roadblocks in trying to get applications for housing and things like that. So if you're working with individuals in a reentry type ministry and you're running into roadblocks, like what kinds of things can you do to work around, you know, things where you're hitting hurdles and you're hitting walls with trying to help them reestablish things like housing and this person has a job, so that's great, but now it's the housing thing, and they're ready to get their own place and they're running into issues. What can people do with that kind of stuff?
So I would say that, you know, if when we're working with individuals, sometimes we have to be ambassadors for them, right? And there's always that fine line of enablement in the worst sense of it, or enable it in the best sense of it. And so in the best sense of it, you know, it really, Pavon, always comes down to relationship. And you may be able to establish a relationship
Right.
with a person or an organization that has access
Right.
to housing that the person you're working with wouldn't be able to for a variety of reasons. Again, we never know in our communities who has been harmed by crime, who's been harmed by somebody who's currently justice involved. And that's part of the balance of, we have to recognize that there's there's a whole lot of harm that is happening in our communities, all of our communities. And so that makes it even more difficult for individuals who are returning home. So I would say it is, you know, are there people that you know that would provide you the access, okay, that then helps provide that person the access. And you know, you do have your reentry coalitions and groups like that. And so it's important, again, to do that collaborative work of getting to know who those individuals are that are the gatekeepers to certain resources. I always say, go with who you know. And so it's also strategically working to develop relationships with people who have the access to the resources that are needed.
Yeah,
And you are simply the relational glue in that.
gotcha. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Any other questions? All right, we had several hang on. We had 22 people. So for those of you who are left, thank you so much for attending and participating. And truly, you know, you'll be getting this. I always send out the slides in a PDF form. I send out information, follow-up information. If there's any of that, I'll look through the chat. We'll figure that out. Mike and I will. Got that, Dr. Davis? You're helping me with that. And then we hopefully you'll be able to join us next month as we really kind of dig into some of this and get ourselves prepared to meet the emerging, what is emerging at this time in life. So thank you again. Have a blessed day. May God keep you. May He bless you. May you rest in His presence and feel His warmth and His strength. Thanks, and have a good day.